On Christmas Eve, the doorbell rang. A pregnant girl stood there. "Do you have any water?" she asked. My husband shouted, "We're not a shelter. Tell her to get lost." My daughter-in-law curled her lip. "She's going to contaminate the food." I slammed my palm on the table. "Set another place," I said. "She's eating with us." They were furious and humiliated, and later, at dinner, she revealed a birthmark that drained the color from my husband's face. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story travels." The doorbell rang at exactly 6:15 p.m. on Christmas Eve, slicing through the warm buzz of conversation in our dining room like a knife through butter. I was putting the final touches on the holiday table, smoothing the burgundy napkins I'd ironed twice, when that sound cut into the cozy bubble I'd spent all day building. "Are you expecting anyone else?" Damien asked from his place at the head of the table, barely glancing up from his phone. At 71, my husband had perfected the talent of looking busy while doing absolutely nothing. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back the same way it had been for 40 years, and his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose gave him a distinguished air, at least in his own mind. "No one that I know of," I replied, wiping my hands on my apron. The smell of rosemary and garlic from our Christmas roast hung in the air, blending with the pine scent from the tree in the corner. Everything was perfect, exactly how I'd planned it. Alina, my daughter-in-law, lifted her eyes from her wine glass with that carefully practiced look of mild irritation she'd honed in the 5 years since she'd married my son, James. "Probably carolers," she said, her voice edged with annoyance at any disruption to our routine. "Just ignore them. They'll go away." At 34, Alina had the kind of sharp beauty that photographs well but feels cold up close. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sleek, polished style, with not a single strand out of place, and her red dress probably cost more than 2 months of my grocery budget. She'd been checking her reflection in the polished silver serving spoons all evening. The doorbell rang again. Longer this time, more insistent. "I'll get it," I said, already moving toward the hallway. James, my 43-year-old son, was absorbed in conversation with his father about some investment opportunity I didn't understand and probably couldn't afford. Neither of them seemed to notice the interruption. When I opened the front door, the December air slapped my cheeks, carrying that particular sharp smell of snow that hasn't yet decided whether to fall. On the porch stood a young woman, maybe 20, with long brown hair hanging in damp waves around her shoulders. She was clearly pregnant, 7 or 8 months along at least, and she was shivering inside a thin, worn-out coat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Do you have some water? I've been walking for hours and I'm really thirsty." Behind me, I heard chairs scrape over the hardwood floor. Damien's voice boomed from the dining room, loud enough to make sure she heard every word. "We're not a shelter. Tell whoever it is to get lost. It's Christmas Eve, for heaven's sake." Heat rushed to my face. After 45 years of marriage, Damien's talent for cruelty could still catch me off guard. I looked at the young woman, really looked at her. Her eyes were a deep, dark brown, almost black, and there was something in them that tugged at an old version of myself. Not the features themselves, but the expression. The way she held herself upright despite being exhausted and frozen. Pride wrapped around desperation. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, stepping aside. "Come in out of the cold." "Mom, what are you doing?" James appeared in the hallway, worry creasing his face. He'd inherited his father's height, but, thankfully, more of my softer features. At 43, he was successful at his accounting firm, married to a woman who looked great on paper, and somehow still missing the compassion I'd tried to raise him with. Alina joined him, still holding her wineglass. When she saw the girl, her face twisted into raw disgust. "Are you out of your mind, Muriel?" she snapped. "She could have something. She'll contaminate the food." Something inside me broke. Maybe it was the way Alina said, "contaminate," as if this young woman were trash. Maybe it was the casual cruelty in Damien's voice from the other room. Or maybe it was the way the girl's hand instantly moved to shield her belly when Alina spoke. I slammed my hand down on the small table in the entryway so hard the ceramic bowl we kept our keys in rattled. Everyone froze. "Set another place," I said, my voice ringing with an authority I hadn't used in years. "She's eating with us." The silence that followed was so thick you could have carved it. Alina's jaw dropped in a way that was anything but elegant. James looked as if someone had just informed him that gravity was optional. From the dining room came the scrape of Damien's chair and the heavy thud of his footsteps. "Muriel, have you completely lost your mind?" he demanded as he stepped into the entryway, his face already flushed with outrage. "We planned a nice family dinner, and you want to invite some vagrant?" "Her name," I cut in, turning back to the young woman, "is—" "What, sweetheart?" "Sophie," she said quietly, though her voice did not tremble. "Sophie Miller." "Sophie is joining us for Christmas dinner," I said, locking eyes with my husband. "And anyone who has a problem with that can explain to me how turning away a pregnant woman on Christmas Eve fits with the Christian values you're always preaching about." Damien's face went through several impressive shades. Purple was especially prominent. "This is ridiculous, Muriel. We don't know anything about her, where she's been, what she wants." "I want to sit down," Sophie said. For the first time since I'd opened the door, I noticed how pale she was. "Please, I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." That was all I needed to hear. I slipped my arm through hers and guided her toward the dining room. "James, grab another chair from the kitchen," I ordered. "Alina, set another place. Damien, pour her some water." Nobody moved. I stopped walking and turned to face my family. There's a certain tone a mother reaches when her patience is completely, absolutely gone. It's a frequency that slices through 43 years of James learning how to tune me out, through 5 years of Alina's polished indifference, through 4 decades of Damien assuming I'll just quietly go along with whatever he decides. James vanished into the kitchen. Alina set her wineglass down with a little too much force and stalked over to the china cabinet. Damien muttered something under his breath about bleeding hearts, but he still filled a glass with ice water. I helped Sophie into the extra chair James brought, placing her between my usual seat and the empty spot where my mother used to sit before she passed away 3 years earlier. Sophie kept her thin coat on, and I noticed how red and chapped her hands were from the cold. "How far along are you, dear?" I asked as I lowered myself into my chair. 7 months, Sophie answered, taking the glass from Damien with a quiet, "Thank you." He didn't bother to acknowledge. Alina came back with a plate and silverware, setting them down louder than necessary. "So, where's the father?" she asked, her voice sharp as a blade. "Out getting high somewhere while you wander around looking for handouts?" "Alina," I warned. "What? It's a reasonable question. Single pregnant girls don't just appear on people's doorsteps on Christmas Eve, not without a story." Sophie's hand tightened around her glass, but she didn't look away. "He's not in the picture anymore," she said steadily. "How convenient," Alina muttered, taking a big swallow of wine. I started serving dinner, spooning rosemary roast onto plates, adding vegetables and Yorkshire pudding. All the food I'd spent the entire day making suddenly felt like props in a play I hadn't agreed to be in. Every small noise seemed louder than usual, the clink of cutlery, the whisper of Sophie's coat, Alina's exaggerated sighs. "So, Sophie," I said, determined to drag the evening back toward something resembling normal, "where are you from?" "Originally from here, in Portland," she replied, cutting her meat into small, neat pieces. "I've been staying with friends recently, but—" She paused, glancing around the table. "Things change." Damien was just pushing food around his plate, barely eating at all. He kept sneaking looks at Sophie when he thought no one noticed. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite identify, not simple curiosity, but something that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. "Friends?" Alina repeated with a snort. "Let me guess, they got tired of supporting you and your baby." "That's enough," I said sharply. But Sophie shook her head. "It's all right, Mrs." She hesitated, looking at me. "Patterson, Muriel Patterson. This is my husband, Damien. My son, James, and his wife, Alina. It's okay, Mrs. Patterson. People make assumptions when they see someone like me. She took a small bite of the Yorkshire pudding, and for the first time since she arrived, she smiled. A real smile. This is wonderful, thank you. Something warm settled in my chest. It's my mother's recipe. She always said food made with love tastes different. My mother used to say the same thing, Sophie replied softly. Used to? I asked gently. She died 6 months ago. Cancer. Her simple words hit the table like a stone dropped into still water. Even Alina had the decency to look uncomfortable. James cleared his throat and reached for his beer. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, I said, and I meant it. I knew exactly what it was like to lose your mother too soon, to have the world feel suddenly unprotected. Sophie nodded, blinking quickly. She would have loved this, she said, motioning to the room, the tree, the decorations, the family dinner. We never had much, but she always tried to make Christmas special. I glanced over at our tree, standing proudly in the corner with its perfectly coordinated gold and burgundy ribbons and carefully placed ornaments. This year, Alina had insisted on hiring a decorator, calling our old tradition of decorating together too chaotic. Looking at it now, all I saw was something beautiful but cold, impressive but stripped of the memories that make holidays matter. Well, you're here now, I said. That's what counts. Damien put his fork down with a thud. Muriel, could I speak with you in the kitchen? He said. It wasn't really a request. I excused myself and followed him. In the kitchen, he immediately began pacing between the island and the sink like a caged animal. What on earth are you doing? He hissed, keeping his voice low, but his agitation painfully obvious. I'm extending basic human kindness to someone who needs help, I replied. She's taking advantage of your soft heart. This is exactly how people end up robbed, Muriel. Or worse. I stared at my husband, the man I'd slept beside for 45 years, and felt something cold settle in the pit of my stomach. She's a pregnant 20-year-old who asked for water, Damien. What do you honestly think she's going to steal? The good china? You don't know what people are capable of these days, he said. There was something in his tone, a nervous edge that went beyond his usual grumbling about plans going off track. He kept glancing toward the dining room, and his hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. Since when do you care about the good china? I asked quietly. You've been telling me for years that I'm too sentimental about my mother's things. Damien didn't answer. He just stared toward the dining room with an expression I couldn't quite read, but didn't trust. When we returned, Sophie was listening politely while James told her about his latest golf tournament win. Alina was scrolling on her phone, probably uploading pictures of her perfectly arranged plate. Sophie caught my eye and smiled, a real grateful smile that reached her eyes and softened her whole face. Thank you, she mouthed. I nodded and sat back down, but the feeling wouldn't leave me, that sense that something fundamental was shifting in our house tonight, something deeper than an uninvited guest or a disrupted holiday routine. As I watched Sophie eat with obvious hunger but flawless manners, as I noticed the way she unconsciously kept one hand resting protectively over her belly while she ate with the other, I realized I wasn't just curious about her situation. I truly wanted to know her story, and I couldn't stop noticing the way Damien kept glancing at her whenever he thought no one was watching, the way his face had gone so pale the moment she first stepped into our dining room. Sophie reached for her water glass and pushed her sleeve up a little. On her wrist, just peeking out from under the cuff of her worn sweater, was a birthmark, a dark crescent moon against her pale skin, the exact same birthmark my husband has on his shoulder. The rest of Christmas Eve dinner went by in a blur of strained small talk and a knot of unease tightening in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about that birthmark, couldn't stop watching Damien's hands shake each time he reached for his glass. Sophie seemed unaware of the tension, eating with obvious relief and answering James's questions about Portland with the kind of detail you only have when you've grown up in a place. "Oh, I know that area," she said when James mentioned his old high school. My mom used to clean houses over there when I was little. Beautiful homes. I always wondered what it'd be like to live in one of them. Something moved across Damien's face then, guilt or recognition or both. He cleared his throat and excused himself to go to the bathroom, but I noticed he was gone for almost 10 minutes. When he finally came back, his face was flushed, and he still wouldn't look me in the eye. After dinner, I insisted that Sophie stay for dessert. Alina made her disapproval clear with a performance of dramatic sighs and dagger-like looks, but I ignored her. There was something about this girl that had triggered every protective instinct I had left. Maybe it was her obvious vulnerability. Maybe it was the way she'd thanked me for the Yorkshire pudding like it was the best food she'd ever tasted. I should probably go, Sophie said as I started clearing plates. I don't want to overstay my welcome. Nonsense, I said firmly. It's Christmas Eve. No one should be alone on Christmas Eve. Alina snorted. Some people prefer to be alone. Maybe that's how she ended up in this situation in the first place. The cruelty in her voice made my stomach twist. I'd always known Alina was self-absorbed, but I'd rarely seen her be outright vicious. Sophie's cheeks flushed, but she stayed quiet. Alina, James said quietly, that's enough. Is it? She shot back, turning on him with the sharp fury that had been building all night. Your mother invites a complete stranger into our home, and I'm just supposed to pretend this is normal? We don't know anything about her, James. She could be on drugs. She could be dangerous. She's pregnant and she asked for water, I cut in. Since when is basic human kindness dangerous? Alina laughed, but there was nothing amused about it. Basic human kindness. Muriel, you're being played. She shows up with some sob story about dead mothers and missing fathers, and you fling the doors wide open. It's pathetic. The word pathetic hung in the air like a slap. Sophie shoved her chair back, her face drained of color. I should go, she said again, more firmly this time. Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Patterson. It was lovely. You'll do no such thing, I said, surprised at the steel in my own voice. I turned to Alina, and for the first time in 5 years, I let her see exactly what I thought of her behavior. That young woman is a guest in my home. If you can't offer her basic respect, you're the one who's welcome to leave. The silence that followed was deafening. Alina's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. James looked mortified. Even Damien, who'd been strangely quiet since returning from the bathroom, stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Excuse me? Alina's voice was dangerously soft. You heard me. I was shaking, but not from fear. From 45 years of swallowed anger, of watching my family treat people like inconveniences to be managed. This is my home, and Sophie is my guest. If you have a problem with that, there's the door. For a moment, I truly thought Alina might walk out. Her face cycled through several shades of red, and her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her wine glass so fiercely I thought it might break. Instead, she pushed her chair back, stood up abruptly, and stormed into the living room, her heels striking the hardwood in sharp, angry beats. James followed her, mumbling apologies, though whether they were meant for me or for her, I couldn't say. That left Sophie, Damien, and me sitting at the table, surrounded by the remains of Christmas dinner and enough tension to choke on. I really should go, Sophie said quietly. I don't want to cause trouble in your family. You're not causing anything, I told her. Some people just don't handle change very well. Damien made a sound that could have been agreement, but when I looked at him, he was watching Sophie with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the polite curiosity James had shown. It was deeper, and it looked a lot like fear. Sophie? He said suddenly, his voice rough. Where did you say you grew up? The question sounded harmless enough, but something in his tone made both of us pay closer attention. Southeast Portland, Sophie replied. Near Mount Tabor. Why? Damien's face went completely white, like someone had drained every drop of blood from it. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles jutted out like jagged stones. Are you all right? I asked, reaching toward him automatically. Fine, he said quickly. Too quickly. Just tired. It's been a long day. But he wasn't fine. He was staring at Sophie like she was a ghost, his breathing shallow and uneven. I had seen Damien handle business disasters, medical emergencies, even my mother's death with more composure than he showed at that table. Mount Tabor's a lovely area, I said carefully, watching his face. Very family-oriented. Sophie nodded. Mom always said she picked that area because she wanted me to grow up somewhere safe. She worked really hard to keep us there. What did your mother do for work? Damien asked. His voice actually cracked on the word mother. She cleaned houses mostly. Sometimes she picked up shifts in the hospital laundry when things got tight. She never complained, though. She always said she was building something for us. Each word seemed to land on Damien like a punch. Sweat had broken out across his forehead, even though the dining room was comfortably cool. What was her name? He asked, barely more than a whisper. Sophie smiled for the first time since Alina's outburst. Elena Martinez, before she married my dad. Elena Miller afterward, though Dad wasn't around long enough for the name change to really matter. I watched my husband's face fall apart, actually collapse, like a building being demolished in slow motion. His breathing turned rough and uneven, and he shoved back from the table so fast his chair crashed to the floor behind him. I need some air, he muttered, stumbling toward the back door that led to the patio. Sophie and I sat frozen, listening to the door slam shut. Is he okay? Sophie asked, genuine concern in her voice. Should I call someone? I stared at the door my husband had just rushed through, my thoughts spinning. Elena Martinez, Mount Tabor. The way Damien had reacted from the moment Sophie walked in, the birthmark on her wrist. 20 years ago, Damien had gone through what he called a midlife crisis. He started working late, traveling to business conferences in cities that never quite made sense, taking long weekend drives to clear his head. I'd suspected there might be another woman, but I'd convinced myself I was imagining things. We'd been married 25 years back then. We had James. And Damien had always claimed to be devoted to his family. At least, that's what I told myself. Mrs. Patterson? Sophie's voice sounded like it was coming from the far end of a long tunnel. Are you all right? I looked at her, really looked at her. This young woman sitting at my table, with her dark eyes and little crescent moon birthmark, and her stories about a mother named Elena who had worked herself to the bone to give her daughter a good life. This girl who'd grown up in the same neighborhood Damien used to drive through on those long, contemplative trips. Sophie, I said slowly, my own voice unfamiliar to my ears. How old are you exactly? I'll be 21 in March, she replied. Why? 21 in March. That meant she'd been born in March 2003, which meant she'd been conceived in the summer of 2002. The same summer Damien started taking those long drives. The same summer he began working late and attending mysterious conferences. The same summer I started seeing charges on our credit card from restaurants I'd never been to and hotels in cities he claimed were for business trips. My hands trembled as I reached for my water glass. The ice had completely melted. The water was lukewarm and did nothing to steady me. Sophie, I said, not certain I wanted to hear her answer. Do you have any other family? Anyone you could stay with? She shook her head. It's just been me and Mom since I was little. She had a sister once, but they lost touch years ago. Mom didn't talk much about family. She always said we were enough for each other. Elena and Sophie, a mother and daughter who had been enough for each other, while Elena scrubbed other people's floors and Sophie grew up staring at the nice houses her mother cleaned, wondering what it would be like to live in one. While Damien and I sat in our comfortable home with our successful son, never knowing that just across town there might be a little girl who shared his distinctive birthmark and that stubborn set of his jaw. From the living room came the sound of raised voices, James and Alina arguing in harsh whispers that weren't quiet at all. Through the back window I could see Damien pacing the patio like a trapped animal, running his hands through his hair in that familiar gesture he only used when he was truly rattled. Sophie looked around our dining room with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not greed, not jealousy, Something sadder. Something like longing. Your home is beautiful, she said softly. Your family is lucky. Lucky. I almost laughed, but I was afraid once I started, it would turn into tears instead. Sophie, I said, making a choice that felt like stepping off a cliff. Would you like to stay the night? We have a guest room. It's late and you shouldn't be walking around Portland alone, not this pregnant. Her eyes went wide. Oh, I couldn't. I've already imposed enough, especially after… She gestured toward the living room, where Alina's voice was rising again. You're not imposing, I said. You're accepting an invitation that's freely given. The truth was, I wasn't ready to let her walk out that door. Not until I understood what was really happening. Not until I knew why my husband looked like he'd seen a ghost the second she arrived. Sophie hesitated, her hand automatically resting over her belly. Are you sure? I don't want to cause more problems, and… The only problem, I cut in firmly, is people who think kindness is a weakness. Through the window, I watched Damien lean against the patio railing, his shoulders shaking. Whether from the cold or from whatever was tearing him up inside, I couldn't tell. But for the first time in 45 years of marriage, I had the unsettling thought that maybe I didn't know my husband at all, and as I looked at Sophie, with her Elena's eyes, Damien's birthmark, and her stories of growing up in the very neighborhood where he'd taken all those secret drives, I had a terrible feeling I was about to find out the truth. I led Sophie upstairs to our guest room, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to admit even to myself. The room was small but cozy, a double bed covered with one of my mother's quilts, and a window that looked out over our neighbor's garden. I always kept it prepared for visitors, though hardly anyone ever stayed over. The bathroom is right across the hall, I told her, placing fresh towels on the dresser. There are extra blankets in the closet if you get cold. Sophie sat down on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the quilt's intricate stitching. This is beautiful, she said. Did you make it? My mother did, I answered. She made one for each of us when we got married, said it would keep us warm when things got hard. She sounds like she was a wonderful woman. She was. I paused in the doorway, studying her profile in the soft lamplight. Sophie, can I ask you something personal? She looked up, those dark, earnest eyes making my chest tighten. Of course. Your father, the one who wasn't around for long. What was his name? Something flickered across her face, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Mom always told me his name was David. David Miller. She hesitated, then shook her head slightly. But I've never really been sure she was telling me the truth. My mouth went dry. What makes you think that? Little things, she said. The way she'd change the subject whenever I asked about him, how she never had any pictures. She never talked about how they met. When I got older, I started to think maybe Miller wasn't even his real last name. Maybe it was just easier to give me a name than to admit she didn't want to talk about who he really was. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. Elena Martinez had given her daughter a false name for her father and had kept his identity hidden for 20 years, and now that daughter was in my guest room, pregnant with his grandchild and bearing his unmistakable birthmark. Sophie, I said carefully, that mark on your wrist, you've had it since you were born? She glanced down at the crescent-shaped mark where her sleeve had slid up again. Oh, this? Yeah, always. Mom used to call it my moon mark. She said it meant I was special. She gave a small, sad smile. She had all kinds of little stories like that. I think she wanted to make sure I never felt weird or ugly because of it. It's not ugly at all, I said softly. It's very distinctive. That's what Mom always told me. She said that one day I might meet someone else with the same mark, and that it would mean something important. Sophie's voice turned wistful. I used to imagine it would be my father, that we'd recognize each other because of it. The irony was so sharp, it almost took my breath away. She had met someone with the same mark. He was downstairs on our patio, probably in the middle of a panic attack. Get some rest, sweetheart, I managed. We'll talk more in the morning. I closed her door gently and stood in the hallway for a long moment, trying to absorb everything I'd just heard. Elena Martinez. David Miller. Obviously a lie. A daughter who'd grown up wondering who her father was while he lived across town, building a life that didn't include her. Downstairs, the house felt unnaturally quiet. James and Alina had apparently moved their argument to their bedroom. I could still catch the occasional sharp word through the door. I found Damien in the kitchen, sitting at the breakfast table with his head in his hands and a tumbler of whiskey in front of him. "Damien," I said quietly. He looked up and I was shocked by how much he seemed to have aged in just 2 hours. The man I'd been married to for 45 years suddenly looked decades older. "Is she staying?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes, in the guest room." I sat across from him and folded my hands on the table. "We need to talk, Muriel," he began. "Elena Martinez," I cut in, "Mount Tabor, summer of 2002. Damien's face collapsed again. He took a shaky sip of whiskey and set the glass down, his hands trembling. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I didn't know," I said. "I suspected something 20 years ago, but I convinced myself I was imagining things." I kept my voice steady, though inside I wanted to scream. I should have trusted my instincts. "You don't understand," he said weakly. "Then make me understand." The anger in my voice surprised even me. "Explain how my husband spent the summer of 2002 having an affair with a woman named Elena Martinez. Explain how she had a daughter 9 months later who just happens to have the same birthmark you do. Explain how you can sit here drinking whiskey while your daughter is upstairs sleeping in our guest room." The word daughter hung between us like an explosion. Damien flinched as if I'd physically hit him. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered. "What wasn't supposed to happen?" I demanded. "The affair? Or the pregnancy?" "Any of it," he said, looking at me with eyes full of guilt and pain. "God, Muriel, none of it was supposed to happen." I stayed silent, waiting, forcing him to finally tell me the whole truth. "I met Elena at a business conference," he began. "She was working for the catering company. We started talking during one of the breaks, and she was so different from anyone I'd ever known, working 2 jobs to put herself through community college, taking care of her sick mother, and never complaining. She was so full of life, so determined." "So you decided to sleep with her," I said flatly. Damien flinched again. "It wasn't like that, not at first. We just talked. I started looking forward to conferences where I knew she'd be working. Then we started meeting for coffee. Innocent things." "When did it stop being innocent?" "That summer," he said quietly. "Her mother died in June, and she was devastated. She had no one, Muriel. No family, no real support. I wanted to help her. By having an affair with her," I said. "By being there for her," he insisted desperately. But somewhere along the line, it became more than that. I didn't know how to put it into words. "When I was with her, I felt like a different person," Damien said quietly. "Like someone better, someone who mattered." The pain in his voice might have moved me once, but right then I was too angry. "And what about us?" I asked. "What about James? Did we not matter?" "Of course you mattered. You matter," he insisted. "That's why I ended it." "When?" "August, when she told me she was pregnant." His voice cracked completely. "She said she was going to keep the baby and I panicked. I told her I couldn't leave my family, that I couldn't be part of her life anymore." I stared at the man I'd spent my life with and felt something cold and solid settle in my chest. "You abandoned her." "I gave her money," he said weakly. "You abandoned a pregnant woman who had just lost her mother and had no one else in the world." "What was I supposed to do?" Damien's voice rose, strained and desperate. "Leave you? Leave James? Blow up our family over a mistake I made?" "So instead, you made Elena and Sophie pay for that mistake," I said. The silence that followed was suffocating. Damien stared down into his whiskey as if it might offer him forgiveness. "She never contacted you?" I asked at last. "Never asked for help?" He shook his head. "I told her not to. I said if she tried to reach me, I'd deny everything. I'd make sure she couldn't prove anything." His voice dropped to a whisper. I was terrified you'd find out. Terrified of losing everything. So instead, you let Elena struggle to raise your daughter alone while you went on living your comfortable life, pretending they didn't exist. I sent money, he repeated, even more weakly. For the first few years, anonymous cashier's checks. I wanted to help, but I couldn't risk. Risk what? I cut in. Risk taking responsibility for your actions? He finally lifted his head, eyes shining with tears. Risk losing you. Those words should have softened something in me, should have reminded me that, in his own twisted way, he'd chosen our marriage, our son, but instead they only fueled my anger. You lost me the moment you broke our vows, Damien. You lost me the moment you walked away from a pregnant woman who depended on you. You just managed to hide it from me for 20 years. Muriel, please, does she know? I interrupted. Does Sophie know who you are? I don't think so, he said. Elena never told her my real name. She probably doesn't even know I live in Portland. I thought about Sophie's wistful comment about someday meeting someone with the same birthmark, about recognizing her father. She had sat 3 feet from him all evening and had no idea. Show me, I said suddenly. He frowned. Show you what? Your birthmark. Show me. Looking confused, Damien rolled up his left sleeve and tugged his collar aside, exposing his shoulder. There it was, the crescent-shaped mark, dark against pale skin. It was identical to Sophie's. Same curve, same size, same color. Jesus, I breathed. She really is yours. Yes. The word was barely a breath. I stared at the mark that had been hidden under his shirt all these years, the undeniable proof that the young woman sleeping in our guest room was his daughter, our son's half-sister. My stepdaughter, I supposed, though even in my head the word felt strange and small compared to the enormity of what it meant. What are we going to do? Damien asked. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't have an immediate answer. What do you do when your husband's secret daughter shows up on Christmas Eve, pregnant and alone? What do you do when you learn the man you've been married to for 45 years abandoned his own child? I don't know, I said honestly, but I know what we're not going to do. We're not going to lie to her anymore. We're not going to let her walk out of here without knowing the truth. Muriel, you can't tell her, he pleaded. It would destroy everything. Everything is already destroyed, Damien. You destroyed it 20 years ago when you chose your comfort over your responsibility. I stood up from the table, feeling drained by the weight of this new reality. That young woman upstairs has spent her entire life wondering about her father, wondering if he ever thought about her, if he regretted leaving. She deserves to know the truth. And James? Damien asked. What about James? Finding out he has a half-sister he's never heard of. James is a grown man. He'll have to deal with it like the rest of us. And Alina? You really think she's going to accept this? I thought of Alina at dinner, her cruelty, her contempt for Sophie, the way she treated anyone beneath her like they were barely human. Alina can accept it or she can leave, I said. I honestly don't care anymore. Damien stared at me, stunned. You can't mean that. I absolutely mean it. I looked down at my husband, the man who had hidden this from me for 2 decades, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. For 20 years, you let me believe I really knew who you were, I said. You let me build my life on a lie. So yes, I mean every word. I left him sitting at the kitchen table with his whiskey and his guilt and went upstairs to our bedroom. But I didn't even try to sleep. Instead, I sat by the window overlooking our backyard, watching the moon filter through the bare branches of the oak tree and thinking about the young woman across the hall, Sophie Miller, who'd grown up wondering about her father while he lived just 20 minutes away, who lost the only parent she'd ever known 6 months ago and was now facing motherhood alone, who had knocked on our door asking for water and walked straight into a family implosion she couldn't possibly understand. Tomorrow, I would have to tell her the truth. Tomorrow, I would have to watch her face when she learned that the man who refused her a glass of water was her father. Tomorrow I would have to help her decide what to do with a truth that would change all of our lives forever. But that night, I just sat by my window and quietly mourned. Mourned the family I'd believed I had, the marriage I'd thought was solid, the 20 years of lies that had quietly led us to this exact moment. Outside, the snow had finally started to fall, dusting our yard in a thin white layer that I knew would be gone by morning, just like everything else I'd once thought was permanent in my life. I woke on Christmas morning to the sound of crying. For a second, groggy and disoriented by lack of sleep and the gray light seeping through my bedroom curtains, I thought it might be a baby. Then reality came crashing back, and I realized the soft, muffled sobs were coming from the guest room. Sophie. I slipped on my robe and padded quietly across the hall, knocking gently on her door. "Sophie, sweetheart, are you all right?" The crying stopped abruptly. "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson, just missing my mom." I opened the door and found her sitting on the edge of the bed, still in the same clothes she'd worn the day before. Her face was streaked with dried tears. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. "Oh, honey." I sat beside her, instinctively reaching out to smooth her hair back from her face, the way I used to do for James when he was small. "The first holidays are always the hardest," I said softly. "She loved Christmas so much," Sophie whispered. "She'd start playing carols in November, and she'd plan these big decorating days for our tiny apartment. We never had much money, but somehow she always made it feel special." I thought of our tree downstairs, professionally decorated, perfectly coordinated, undeniably beautiful, and yet completely devoid of the kind of chaotic, homemade memories Sophie was describing. "She sounds like she was an incredible mother," I said. "She was everything to me," Sophie replied. "I don't know how to do this without her." Her hand moved to her belly. "I don't know how to be a mother without my mother." The irony was brutal. Damien's daughter, grieving the only parent she'd ever had, while her biological father slept comfortably just down the hall. Elena Martinez had been forced to be everything to her daughter, because Damien had walked away from them both. "Sophie," I began carefully, "there's something I need to tell you, about last night, about my husband's reaction to you." She lifted her tear-reddened eyes to mine, those same dark eyes Damien had described when he confessed everything. "Is he okay?" she asked. "He seemed really upset. How do you tell someone that their entire identity has been built on half-truths? How do you explain that the father they've imagined their whole life has been living 20 minutes away, building a comfortable life while they struggled to stay afloat?" "Damien recognized you," I said slowly. "Not you personally, but your mother's name." I took a breath. "Sophie, there's something you need to know about your father." "About David Miller?" she asked, going very still. "What do you mean?" "David Miller wasn't his real name," I said. "Your mother gave you a false name to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Sophie asked, her voice tightening. I inhaled, knowing that what I said next would shatter her world. "From the truth, that your father was a married man who walked away from her when she told him she was pregnant." The color drained from Sophie's face. "How do you know that?" she whispered. "Because your father is my husband." The silence that followed was so deep, I could hear the old house creak around us. Downstairs, I could faintly make out Damien moving in the kitchen, probably making coffee, going through the motions of a normal Christmas morning. "That's impossible," Sophie said finally. "I wish it were," I replied. I reached for her hand, but she jerked away from me. "Sophie, I know this is a lot to take in." "You're lying." She stood up abruptly, backing away toward the window. "This is some disgusting joke. Why would you say something like that?" "Because it's the truth," I said steadily. "Your mother's name was Elena Martinez. She worked catering events. She met my husband at business conferences in the summer of 2002. When she told him she was pregnant, he gave her money to disappear and told her never to contact him again." Sophie's breathing turned fast and shallow. She pressed her back against the window pane, one hand clamped protectively over her belly. No. My mother would have told me. She wouldn't have kept something like that from me." "She was trying to protect you," I said softly. Just like she protected you by giving you a false name for your father. Prove it. Sophie's voice sharpened, anger blazing through the shock. If what you're saying is true, prove it. I thought of the birthmark, of Damien's panic, of every little piece that had been falling into place since she walked into our house. The birthmark on your wrist, I said. Damien has the same one, in the same place. Sophie looked down at her wrist as though seeing the crescent moon-shaped mark for the first time. Lots of people have birthmarks, she said. Not like that, I replied. Not that exact shape in that exact spot. I stood slowly, careful not to crowd her. Sophie, I know this is overwhelming. I know this is the last thing in the world you expected to hear, but I couldn't let you leave without knowing the truth. The truth? Her voice broke. The truth is that my mother worked herself to death trying to take care of me. The truth is she cleaned other people's houses and did hospital laundry and never complained. Not once. The truth is she told me my father was a good man who just couldn't be in our lives. Every word felt like a blow. Elena had protected Damien, even after he'd abandoned her. She'd let her daughter believe her father was a decent man, rather than the coward he truly was. She lied to protect him, Sophie said, tears streaming freely now. She spent 20 years protecting a man who threw us away like garbage. She lied to protect you, I corrected gently, so you wouldn't grow up knowing your father chose not to be there for you. Well, now I know anyway, don't I? Sophie's voice had turned bitter, edged with a hardness that made her sound older than her 20 years. Now I know that while my mom was working 2 jobs and skipping meals so I could eat, my father was living in a nice house with his real family, pretending we didn't exist. The pain in her voice was almost unbearable. I wanted desperately to soften it, to make it hurt less somehow, but there's no kind way to unwrap that kind of betrayal. Sophie, does he know I'm here? Does he know who I am? Yes, I said. He's known since last night. She let out a short, broken laugh. And he still hasn't said anything to me. Even now, knowing who I am, he can't even acknowledge me. He's scared, I said quietly. I don't care if he's scared. Sophie's voice rose, and I heard movement downstairs. Damien and probably James reacting to the sound. I've been scared my whole life. Scared we wouldn't have enough for rent. Scared my mom would get sick and I'd be left alone. Scared I'd end up just like her, working myself to death for people who don't even see me. I never had a choice about being scared. He did. Heavy footsteps on the stairs told me this conversation was about to get even more complicated. James appeared in the doorway first, hair a mess, wearing old pajama pants and a t-shirt he'd probably had since college. Mom, is everything okay? We heard shouting. Behind him came Damien, already fully dressed despite the early hour, his face ashen with exhaustion and dread. When his eyes met Sophie's, she went completely still. So, she said, her voice low and deadly calm, you're my father. James blinked, looking between Sophie and us like he'd walked into the middle of a play without knowing the script. What's going on? Your father, I said, not looking away from Damien, had an affair 20 years ago. This young woman is your half-sister. The words detonated in the small guest room. James's mouth dropped open. Damien's hand shot out to grip the doorframe as if he might collapse without it. That's impossible, James managed. Dad would never— Show her, I said to Damien. Show her the birthmark. Muriel, show her. With shaking hands, Damien rolled up his sleeve and tugged his collar aside to reveal the crescent-shaped birthmark on his shoulder. Sophie stared at it, then lifted her own wrist, comparing the 2 marks, identical in shape, size, and color. Oh my God, James breathed. Oh my God, it's true. Sophie's composure shattered. She sank back onto the bed, sobs tearing through her, her whole body shaking. 20 years, she gasped between sobs. 20 years. My mother struggled alone while you lived here with your real family. Sophie, please. Damien took a step forward, but she recoiled so violently he froze where he was. Don't touch me. Don't you dare touch me. I can explain. Explain what? she snapped. How you abandoned a pregnant woman, how you let your daughter grow up in poverty while you lived comfortably 20 minutes away? She swiped at her face with her sleeves, eyes blazing. Did you ever even think about us? Did you ever wonder if we were okay? His silence was answer enough. My mother died 6 months ago, Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. Cancer. We couldn't afford good treatment. We couldn't afford time off work. She died in a charity ward, apologizing to me because she couldn't give me a better life. I sent money, Damien began weakly. When did you send money? The first few years, he stammered. Cashier's checks. I wanted to help. We never got a cent from you, Sophie cut in. Ever. My mother worked herself into the ground to support us. She stood up, facing him head-on, and there was a courage in her posture that reminded me painfully of my younger self. Do you know what she told me before she died? Sophie asked. She said she was sorry she couldn't give me a father, that every child deserves 2 parents and she'd failed me because she couldn't give me that. Damien was crying now, silent tears slipping down his cheeks. Elena always, don't say her name. Sophie's voice was as sharp as broken glass. You don't get to say her name. You gave up that right when you abandoned her. From downstairs, I heard footsteps and Elena's annoyed voice calling up the stairs. What is all this noise? Some of us are trying to sleep. This should be good, James muttered under his breath, looking a little green. Elena appeared in the doorway in an expensive silk robe, her hair perfectly arranged, as if even sleep wasn't allowed to muss her up. When she saw us all squeezed into the guest room, Sophie crying, Damien looking destroyed, her expression flickered from irritation to alarm. What is going on? Sophie is James's half-sister, I said flatly. Damien is her father. For a moment, Elena just stared like we'd started speaking another language. Then she began to laugh. Not a genuine laugh, but a high, shaky, hysterical one that comes when reality feels too ridiculous to accept. You're joking, right? This is some kind of Christmas prank. I wish it were, I said. Her laughter stopped abruptly. She looked at Sophie again, at the birthmark, at the resemblance to Damien now glaringly obvious once you knew to look for it. Well, she said finally, her voice as cold as the snow outside, that explains a lot about last night. Elena, James started, does this mean she's going to expect money? Elena went on, ignoring him. Inheritance? Because I should point out that illegitimate children don't automatically— Get out, Sophie said quietly. Excuse me? Elena blinked. I said get out. Sophie rose to her feet. Even 7 months pregnant and half Elena's size, there was something in her presence that made my polished, entitled daughter-in-law instinctively step back. I don't want your money, Sophie said. I don't want anything from any of you. I just want you to get out of my sight. Elena's face flushed a furious red. How dare you talk to me like that in my own home? It's not your home, I cut in sharply. It's mine, and if anyone should be leaving, it's you. The look Elena gave me was pure venom. Fine, she snapped, but don't expect me to be part of this circus. I married James, not his father's bastard children. The word bastard hung in the air like a curse. Sophie flinched at the word as if she'd been slapped, but then her spine straightened. You're right, she said, with a dignity that put all of us to shame. I am a bastard. My mother wasn't married when she had me, and my father abandoned us. But at least I know what it means to work for what I have. At least I understand loyalty and sacrifice. That's more than I can say for you. Elena opened her mouth to fire back, but James cut in. That's enough. Both of you. He looked around the room at the wreckage of his family. His father, who'd been lying for 20 years. His mother, who'd just had her marriage shattered. His pregnant half-sister, who'd appeared on their doorstep. And his wife, who was treating all of it like a social inconvenience instead of a human tragedy. I need some air, he muttered, and walked out. Elena swept after him, her silk robe trailing behind her like a costume in a bad play. That left only Sophie, Damien, and me in the guest room, which suddenly felt far too small to hold everything that had just been exposed: anger, grief, betrayal, and secrets that had finally clawed their way into the light. "I should go," Sophie said quietly, reaching for her thin coat. "No," I replied firmly. "You shouldn't. Not like this." "Why?" She looked at me with eyes far too old for her age. "So you can all figure out how to manage the inconvenience I am? So your husband can come up with a better excuse for throwing away his own child?" "So we can figure out how to make this right," I said. Sophie gave a humorless laugh. "There is no making this right. You can't bring my mother back. You can't give me back the 20 years I spent wondering who my father was. You can't erase the damage." She was right, and all of us knew it. Some betrayals cut too deep. Some abandonments are too complete to be patched over with apologies and remorse. But as I watched her collect her few belongings, preparing to walk out of our lives as abruptly as she'd entered them, I knew that letting her go would be one last, unforgivable failure, another decision that said she didn't matter. "Sophie," I said as she reached the doorway, "you don't have to forgive us. You don't ever have to see us again. But please don't leave believing that what happened to you and your mother was acceptable. Please don't leave thinking you didn't matter." She paused, back still turned. "The problem isn't that I think I don't matter, Mrs. Patterson," she said softly. "The problem is that for 20 years, none of you thought I mattered." And then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her shampoo and the weight of a truth that could never be unsaid. I found her sitting on the front steps, her thin coat pulled around her shoulders like flimsy armor against the December cold. She wasn't crying anymore. Her face had settled into that empty, numb expression that only comes after you've run out of tears. "The buses don't run on Christmas Day," I said, lowering myself onto the frozen concrete beside her. "I'll walk," she replied. "You're 7 months pregnant, Sophie. You can't walk across Portland in this weather." She didn't answer. She just stared out at our quiet little street, at the neat lawns and tidy houses. I wondered what she saw, the life she might have had if her father had made different choices, or the neighborhood where she'd always been near but never truly belonged. Behind us, raised voices drifted from the house. James and Alina were arguing in the kitchen, their words muffled but their rage sharp and clear. Damien was probably hiding in his study, the way he always did when faced with problems he didn't want to confront. "I meant what I said," Sophie murmured. "I don't want anything from your family. I just want to disappear and pretend this never happened." "Is that what your mother would have wanted for you?" I asked. Her composure cracked just a little. "My mother would have wanted me to be happy," she said. "She would have wanted me to build a good life for my baby without getting tangled up in other people's mistakes." "And what about what you want?" I asked. She was silent for so long that I wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I want my mother back," she said. "I want to not be alone. I want my baby to have a family that actually wants him." She gave a bitter little laugh. "But we don't always get what we want, do we?" The front door opened behind us, and James stepped out onto the porch. He'd thrown on jeans and a sweater, but his hair was still rumpled, his face pale and stunned. He looked at Sophie as if she were some complex equation he didn't know how to solve. "Can we talk?" he asked, uncertain. Sophie glanced at me, then nodded. "I suppose." James sat on the step below us, turning so he faced Sophie directly. For a long moment they just looked at each other, two people who shared blood but had grown up in completely different worlds. "I'm sorry," James said at last, "for what my father did to you and your mother. For what our family did." "Your family didn't do anything," Sophie replied. "Your father did. There's a difference." "Is there?" James asked quietly. "We all benefited from his decision to abandon you. Every comfort I had growing up, every opportunity, every advantage, it all came from the same place. From him walking away from you." I watched my son struggle with the realization that his privileged life had been built, at least in part, on his father's betrayal of another family. It hurt to see it, but it was a truth he needed to face. "You didn't know," Sophie said. There was no anger in her voice now, just exhaustion. "That doesn't make it right," James replied. "No," she agreed, "but it also doesn't make it your fault." They fell into a heavy silence, two siblings who should have shared bedrooms and secrets and late-night conversations, strangers now, who'd been robbed of all of that. "What's she like?" Sophie asked suddenly. "Your wife?" James sighed. "Alina is complicated. She wasn't always like this. When we first met, she was different. Kinder." "What changed?" Sophie asked. "Money," he said simply. "Status. The longer we were married, the more important those things became to her." He stared down at his hands. "I should have seen it sooner," he admitted. "Should have realized what she was turning into." The front door flew open so hard, the whole house seemed to shudder. Alina stood there in the doorway, now fully dressed in a designer outfit that probably cost more than Sophie earned in a month. "I cannot believe you're all out here having some kind of family bonding session," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "James, get in the car. We're leaving." "We're not going anywhere," James replied, not moving from the steps. "Excuse me?" "I said we're not leaving. This is my family, Alina, all of it, including Sophie." Alina's face went white, then flushed red, then pale again. "That girl is not your family," she snapped. "She's a stranger who showed up yesterday with a sob story." "That girl," James said, rising slowly to his feet, "is my half-sister. And if you can't accept that, then maybe you should be the one to go." The look she gave him was pure poison. "Fine. But don't expect me to be here when you come to your senses." She spun on her heel and stormed back into the house. Within minutes, we could hear her upstairs, slamming drawers and yanking things out of closets, stuffing them into suitcases. Every crash made James flinch, but he didn't move to stop her. "Are you sure about this?" Sophie asked quietly. "I don't want to be the reason your marriage ends." "You're not the reason," James said. "You're just the trigger. This has been coming for years. I've just been too much of a coward to admit it." About 20 minutes later, Alina reappeared, hauling 2 large suitcases behind her, her face carved into lines of outrage and injured pride. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at James with something like one last shred of hope. "Last chance," she said. "Choose your real family, or choose her." James stood, and I held my breath, wondering if he would fold under pressure the way his father had 20 years earlier. Instead, he walked down the steps, leaned in, and kissed Alina lightly on the cheek. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. Alina stared at him for a long, stunned second. Then she turned to Sophie. "I hope you're happy," she spat. "You just destroyed a marriage that took 5 years to build." "I didn't destroy anything," Sophie said calmly. "I just showed you what was already broken." Alina's Mercedes started with a dramatic roar, and she tore out of the driveway like she was escaping a disaster scene. We watched in silence until her taillights disappeared around the corner. "Well," James said, lowering himself back onto the steps. "That happened." "I'm sorry," Sophie murmured again. "Don't be," James replied. "I should have stood up to her a long time ago. Maybe if I had, she wouldn't have turned into someone who can be that cruel to a pregnant woman." The front door opened again, much more quietly this time, and Damien stepped out. He looked as if he'd aged another 10 years in just a few hours, his face gaunt and exhausted. "Sophie," he said, his voice raw. "Please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," Sophie answered, not even looking at him. "You made your choice 20 years ago. I'm making mine now." "I was wrong," Damien said. "I know that. I was scared and selfish, and I made the worst mistake of my life." "The worst decision of your life was the best thing that ever happened to me," Sophie fired back. "Because it meant I was raised by Elena Martinez, who was worth 10 of you. She showed me what real love looks like, what sacrifice is, what it means to put someone else first." Damien flinched as if she'd physically hit him. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly. You're right, Sophie replied. You don't. And I'm not going to hand it to you just so you can feel better about what you did. Then what can I do? He asked, desperate. How do I make this right? You can't, Sophie said, pushing herself carefully to her feet, one hand pressed against her lower back. Some things can't be fixed, Mr. Patterson. Some wounds don't heal. She started down the steps, but I reached out and gently caught her arm. Sophie, wait. I can't do this anymore, Mrs. Patterson, she said, her voice shaking. I can't sit here and listen to him try to justify abandoning my mother. I have to go. Where will you go? I don't know. I'll figure something out. I always do. Something inside me snapped, cleanly, decisively. This brave young woman, carrying my husband's grandchild, getting ready to walk into uncertainty rather than accept help from the family that had already failed her once. The same story repeating itself. Patterson men walking away from their responsibilities while women were left to pay the price. No, I said, standing up. You're not going anywhere. Sophie stared at me, startled. What? I turned to Damien, and for the first time in 45 years of marriage, I stopped shielding him from the truth of what I felt. Get out, I said. Muriel. I said get out. Pack your things and leave, now. You can't be serious. This is my house too. Actually, it's not, I replied. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened my banking app, and held up the screen. I've been paying the mortgage for the last 3 years while you threw our money into investments that never went anywhere. The house is in my name, bought with my inheritance from my mother, so when I tell you to get out, I mean it. Damien stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. Maybe he was. Maybe the version of me who would have swallowed this betrayal and helped him bury it had disappeared the moment Sophie walked through our door. Where am I supposed to go? He asked weakly. I honestly don't care, I said. Get an apartment, stay in a hotel, move in with one of your golf buddies, just get out of my sight. Muriel, please, we can work this out. We've been married 45 years. 45 years built on a lie, I answered. I'm not spending one more day pretending to be married to a man who could abandon his own child. James was staring at me with something like awe. Sophie looked stunned. I was even a little surprised at myself, but I didn't back down. You have 1 hour, I said. Take what you need and go. We'll handle the rest through lawyers. For a second, I thought he might argue, but something in my face must have told him I wasn't bluffing. He turned and went back inside, shoulders slumped in defeat. Sophie sank down onto the steps again. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. I don't expect you to choose me over your husband, Sophie murmured. I'm not choosing you over my husband, I said, sitting down beside her. I'm choosing right over wrong. I'm choosing the family I want to build instead of the one I just happened to marry into. She frowned slightly. What does that mean? I took a deep breath, knowing what I was about to say would change both our lives. It means I'm asking you to stay, I said. Not as a guest, not as someone we're helping out of guilt or obligation, as family, as my daughter, if you'll let me. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. You don't even know me. I know enough, I said. I know you're brave and kind and stronger than you realize. I know you carry your mother's memory with you in everything you do. I know my grandchild is lucky to have you. Your grandchild, she repeated, her voice trembling. That baby you're carrying is my grandchild, whether Damien accepts it or not, and I refuse to let another Patterson walk away from their responsibilities. Sophie started crying again, but this time it was different. Less rage and grief, more something that looked a lot like hope. I don't know how to be part of a family, she whispered. It's always just been me and my mom. Then we'll learn together, I said, taking her hand. We'll figure it out as we go. Through the front window, we could see Damien moving around upstairs, stuffing 45 years of marriage into suitcases. In the kitchen, James was making coffee, no doubt trying to make sense of how his entire life had been turned upside down in a single day. But out on the porch, in the cold December air, something new was beginning. Not the family any of us had expected, but the family we were choosing, the one we actually deserved. "Sophie," I said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Welcome home." 6 months later, I woke to the sound I'd secretly been waiting my whole life to hear, my grandson crying in the nursery down the hall. Not the frantic, panicked wail of a sick or starving baby, just the indignant little cry of someone who'd decided he had opinions now. I pulled on my robe and padded down the hallway to the room that had once been Damien's study. Now it was a nursery. Soft yellow walls, hand-painted animals Sophie and I had added together during her last trimester. Morning light filtered through gauzy curtains, bathing everything in warm gold. Sophie was already there, of course, lifting tiny Gabriel from his crib with the easy grace of someone who'd only been a mother for 3 weeks but seemed born to it. She looked up when she heard me, her face brightening with a smile I'd never seen on her during those first hard days. "Good morning, Grandma," she said softly. My heart still did a little flip every time she called me that. "Someone's ready for breakfast." I stepped into the room, still a little awed by how perfectly Gabriel fit in her arms, how natural she looked despite being only 21 and having no real support for so long. Elena had raised her well, given her the strength and confidence to face motherhood alone. Only now she wasn't alone anymore. "He's got your eyes," I said, brushing a fingertip over Gabriel's tiny fist as he latched on and nursed with fierce determination. "He's got his grandfather's stubborn streak," Sophie laughed. "Look how he grips my finger. He's not letting go of anything." We'd learned to talk about Damien in neutral tones, for Gabriel's sake if nothing else, not with hatred, but with the distant, matter-of-fact way you talk about someone who exists on the edge of your life. A name on paper, a person you used to know. The truth was, I rarely thought about him anymore. I knew where he was now. A 1-bedroom downtown, part-time work at an insurance office after all those investments failed to become anything real. James met him sometimes for stiff coffees that never lasted more than an hour. But the man who'd shared my bed for 45 years felt like someone from a different life, someone I'd once cared for, but never really understood. James left early for his appointment with the lawyer, Sophie said, settling into the rocking chair we'd rescued from an estate sale and refinished together. "He said he'll call later with an update." James had handled my divorce with the same meticulous focus that made him a good accountant. We'd split things fairly. Damien took his clothes, his golf clubs, and half our savings. I kept the house, my mother's furniture, and the family I was building with Sophie and Gabriel. After 45 years of marriage, the end hadn't been explosive, just final. 2 people walking separate paths who eventually realized they were no longer heading in the same direction. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked, settling into the window seat where I'd spent so many mornings during Sophie's pregnancy, watching her battle nausea with the same quiet grace she brought to everything. "Better than I thought I would," she said. "Gabriel only woke up twice, and he went right back to sleep after he ate." She looked down at her son with that familiar expression of wonder that never seemed to fade. "I keep thinking how much Mom would have loved this," she said softly. "The late-night feedings, the little noises he makes when he's content. She always said babies were proof the world was still full of magic." I'd learned not to feel sad when Sophie talked about Elena anymore. Instead, I felt grateful. Grateful that this extraordinary woman had raised such an extraordinary daughter. Grateful that she'd poured so much strength and grace into Sophie that it now flowed naturally into the way she mothered Gabriel. Grateful that Elena's love didn't end at her grave. It lived on in Sophie, and now, in that little boy. "She's part of him, you know," I said quietly. "All the love she gave you, all the lessons she taught you, Gabriel will carry that with him." Sophie nodded, her eyes shining, but her tears held back. In the months since Christmas Eve, she had changed. The frightened, exhausted young woman who had appeared on my doorstep had become someone who knew her worth and refused to be treated as anything less than she deserved. The doorbell rang downstairs and I checked the time. 7:30 a.m., too early for anyone just dropping by. "I'll get it," I said, pressing a kiss to Gabriel's forehead before heading downstairs. Through the peephole, I saw Damien standing on the porch. He looked older, smaller somehow than he had 6 months earlier. He held a small, wrapped package, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. I opened the door but didn't step aside to let him in. "Damien." "Muriel," he said. "I know it's early, but I brought something for the baby." He held out the package. His hands were trembling. Whether from nerves or something else, I couldn't tell and didn't especially care. "You could have called first," I said. "Would you have answered?" he asked. "Probably not." I took the package but left it unopened in my hand. "What do you want, Damien?" "I want to meet my grandson," he said quietly. "I want to apologize to Sophie. I want to try to make things right." "And what makes you think any of us want that?" He was silent for a long moment, looking past me into the house he'd shared with me for so many years. "Because I'm dying, Muriel." The words landed like a physical blow, but I kept my expression steady. "What?" "Lung cancer, stage 3. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. Probably less." My fingers tightened around the doorframe as I absorbed that. For all he'd done, for all the damage he'd caused, my first instinct was still to comfort him. 45 years of marriage don't evaporate, even if you later discover much of it sat on top of lies. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "I don't want to die without meeting my grandson," he went on. "Without telling Sophie how sorry I am for what I did to her and her mother." "Sophie doesn't owe you forgiveness just because you're dying," I said. "I know that," he replied. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for 5 minutes. 5 minutes to tell her that walking away from her was the worst thing I ever did, that not knowing her has been the greatest loss of my life." I looked at him. This man I had once loved, who had given me James and decades of companionship, and who had also abandoned his own child. He looked frightened, worn down, diminished. "Wait here," I said. I found Sophie in the kitchen, warming a bottle even though Gabriel was still sleeping soundly in his carrier on the counter. She looked up immediately, reading my face. "Is everything okay?" "Damien's here," I said. "He wants to meet Gabriel and talk to you." Sophie went very still. "Does he know about—" She gestured toward Gabriel. "He knows he has a grandson," I said. "Sophie, there's something else. He's sick. Cancer. He says he doesn't have long." I watched emotions move through her, anger, grief, confusion, and something that looked very much like pity. She didn't say anything for a long time. "What do you think I should do?" she asked at last. "I think you should do whatever feels right to you," I answered. "Whatever you can live with." Sophie looked down at Gabriel, the little boy who would grow up never questioning whether he was wanted or loved, who would never have to wonder where he belonged. She touched his tiny hand, and he curled his fingers around hers automatically. 5 minutes, she said quietly, "in the living room, and you stay with us." I nodded and went back to the front door, where Damien still stood, hovering on the threshold like a man waiting for a verdict. 5 minutes, I told him, "in the living room, and I stay the whole time." "Thank you," he whispered. I led him into the living room, the same room where, 6 months earlier, we'd shared that disastrous Christmas Eve dinner, where Sophie had walked in as a stranger and, without knowing it, exposed every hidden fault line in our family. She was already there, holding Gabriel, her face carefully guarded. Damien stopped just inside the doorway, staring at his daughter and grandson as if trying to etch them into his memory. The resemblance between them was impossible to ignore now. The stubborn jawline, the dark eyes, the quiet way they both held themselves, even under pressure. "Sophie," he said, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for letting me see you." She didn't answer. She just waited. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he began. "I know there's nothing I can say that will erase what I did to you and to your mother. But I need you to know that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life." Sophie's expression remained unreadable. "Why now?" she asked. "Because you're dying?" "No," he said. "I've known it was wrong from the beginning." I'd stopped feeling sad when Sophie talked about Elena. Instead, I felt grateful. Grateful that this remarkable woman had raised such a remarkable daughter. Grateful that she'd given Sophie the strength and grace that now made her such a wonderful mother. Grateful that Elena's love lived on, first in Sophie and now in Gabriel. "She's part of him, you know," I said softly. "Every bit of love she gave you, every lesson she taught you, Gabriel will carry that with him." Sophie nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Over the past few months, she'd grown stronger, more assured of her place in our little family. The frightened, heavily pregnant girl who'd stood on my doorstep on Christmas Eve was gone. In her place stood a young woman who knew her value and refused to accept less than she deserved. The doorbell rang downstairs, and I glanced at the clock. 7:30 a.m. Too early for casual visitors. "I'll get it," I said, kissing Gabriel's forehead before heading down. Through the peephole, I saw Damien standing on the porch. He looked older, shrunken somehow, compared to 6 months ago. He held a small wrapped package and was shifting his weight uneasily from foot to foot. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "Damien, Muriel," he said. "I know it's early, but I brought something for the baby." He held out the package. His hands were shaking. Whether from nerves or something else, I didn't know, and wasn't sure I cared. "You could have called first," I said. "Would you have answered?" he asked. "Probably not." I took the package but left it unopened in my hand. "What do you want, Damien?" "I want to meet my grandson," he said quietly. "I want to apologize to Sophie. I want to try to make things right." "And what makes you think any of us want that?" I asked. He stared past me into the house he'd once lived in. "Because I'm dying, Muriel." The words hit me like a punch, but I kept my face neutral. "What?" "Lung cancer, stage 3. The doctors say maybe 6 months, probably less." I tightened my grip on the doorframe as I processed that. For all the hurt and betrayal, my first instinct was still to reach out. 45 years of marriage don't vanish overnight, even when you later learn how much of it was built on betrayal. "I'm sorry," I said, and I truly was. "I don't want to die without meeting my grandson," he continued, "without telling Sophie how sorry I am for what I did to her and to her mother." "Sophie doesn't owe you forgiveness just because you're dying," I said. "I know," he replied. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for 5 minutes. 5 minutes to tell her that leaving her was the worst thing I ever did, that not knowing her has been the greatest loss of my life." I looked at the man I'd once loved, the father of my son, the same man who'd walked away from his own child. He seemed smaller now, frightened and worn. "Wait here," I said. I found Sophie in the kitchen, warming a bottle even though Gabriel was still content, sleeping in his carrier on the counter. She looked up and immediately read my face. "What's wrong?" "Damien's here," I said. "He wants to meet Gabriel and talk to you." Sophie went completely still. "Does he know about—" She gestured toward Gabriel. "He knows he has a grandson," I said. "And Sophie, there's more. He's sick. Cancer. He says he doesn't have long." I watched emotions battle across her face, anger, sadness, confusion, and something close to pity. She didn't speak for a long time. "What do you think I should do?" she asked at last. "I think you should do whatever feels right for you," I said. "Whatever you can live with." Sophie looked down at Gabriel. This perfect little boy who would grow up knowing he was wanted, who would never question his place in the world. She touched his tiny hand, and his fingers curled around hers. 5 minutes, she said quietly. "In the living room, and you stay with us." I nodded and went back to the door, where Damien still stood, looking like a man waiting for a sentence. 5 minutes, I told him. "Living room. I'll be there the whole time." "Thank you," he whispered. I led him into the living room, the same room where everything had exploded 6 months earlier, where Sophie had unknowingly uncovered every secret we'd tried to bury. She was already seated, holding Gabriel, her face carefully unreadable. Damien stopped just inside the doorway, staring at his daughter and grandson as if trying to burn the image into his mind. Now that I knew what to look for, the resemblance between them was undeniable. The jawline, the dark eyes, the quiet, steady posture, even in the middle of pain. "Sophie," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Thank you for letting me see you." She didn't answer, just waited. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. "I know there's nothing I can say that can undo what I did to you and your mother, but I need you to know that walking away from you was the biggest mistake of my life." Sophie's face stayed calm. "Why now?" she asked. "Because you're dying?" "No," he said. "I've known it was wrong from the beginning. I was just too much of a coward to admit it. Too selfish to face the consequences of what I'd done. And now?" His face crumpled. "Now I'm running out of time to tell you that I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you were a scared little girl. I'm sorry your mother had to work herself to exhaustion because I wasn't helping. I'm sorry you grew up believing your father didn't want you, when the truth is, I thought about you every single day." "If you thought about me every day," Sophie asked quietly, "why didn't you ever try to find me?" "Because I was afraid you'd reject me," he said, "afraid of what it would do to my marriage, to my relationship with James. Because I was selfish and weak and convinced myself you were better off without me." Sophie was silent for a long time, studying the man who was her father but had never been her dad. Gabriel shifted in her arms, making those soft little sounds babies make when they dream. "You're right," she said at last. "I was better off without you." Elena Martinez was the best parent any child could have asked for. She gave me everything I needed: love, stability, values, strength. She taught me how to work, how to be kind, how to take care of the people I love. Pain flashed across Damien's face, but Sophie wasn't finished. "You want to know the difference between you and her?" she continued. "When she was dying, she spent her last days making sure I knew I was loved, that she was proud of me. She used her final words to lift me up, not to tear me down." She stood, shifting Gabriel to her shoulder. "You abandoned me once because you were afraid of facing the consequences of your actions," she said. "I won't let you abandon my son the same way." "What does that mean?" he asked hoarsely. "It means if you want to be part of Gabriel's life, you're going to have to prove you can put someone else's needs above your own. It means showing up consistently, not just when it's easy or when you feel guilty." Damien's eyes filled with cautious hope. "You'd let me be part of his life?" "I'll let you try to earn that place," Sophie said. "But the first time you disappoint him, the first time you hurt him the way you hurt me, it's over. No second chances, no excuses. Gabriel deserves better than that." "I understand," he said, tears running freely. "I want to try. I want to be better than I was." Sophie glanced at me, and for a moment, I saw Elena in her, the strength in her gaze, the clarity in her expression. "We'll see," she said. She stepped closer, just enough for him to see Gabriel clearly. "This is your grandson," she said. "His name is Gabriel James Martinez Patterson. He's 3 weeks old. He loves being held, and he's already the smartest baby in the world." Damien stared down at Gabriel with a mixture of awe, grief, and love. "He's perfect," he whispered. "Yes, he is," Sophie said. "And he's going to grow up knowing exactly how loved and wanted he is. That's a promise." "Can I—" Damien swallowed. "Can I hold him?" Sophie hesitated for a heartbeat, then carefully placed Gabriel in his arms. Damien held the baby like he was made of glass, tears falling onto the blanket. "Hello, Gabriel," he whispered. "I'm your grandfather, and I promise you, I'm going to do better by you than I did by your mother." We stayed like that for a few minutes, 3 generations of a family that had been shattered, slowly trying to learn how to heal. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the reunion anyone would have wished for. But it was honest, and that was more than we'd ever had before. When Gabriel started fussing, Sophie gently took him back. "He's hungry again," she said. "Growing boys need constant fuel. Damien nodded, reluctant to let go of the moment. "Thank you for letting me meet him," he said, "for giving me a chance I don't deserve." "You don't deserve it," Sophie agreed, "but he does. Every child deserves to know their family, even when that family is complicated." After Damien left, Sophie and I sat in the kitchen while Gabriel napped in his carrier. Morning sunlight poured in, lighting up the drawings Sophie had made for the nursery, the shared shopping lists on the fridge, the family photos, new and old, now including Gabriel and Sophie beside the pictures of James and me. "Do you think I did the right thing?" Sophie asked, stirring honey into her tea. "I think you did the brave thing," I said. "That's not always the same as the right thing, but it's usually close." "I'm scared he'll hurt Gabriel the way he hurt me," she admitted. "If he does, we'll protect Gabriel the same way Elena protected you," I said. "But there's one thing you have that Elena didn't." "What's that?" "A family behind you," I said. "James is going to be the best uncle that boy could ever dream of. I'll be the grandmother who spoils him, bakes him cookies, and tells him stories about all the strong women in his family, and you'll be the mother who loves him enough to set boundaries and demand better from the people in his life." Sophie smiled and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "I never thought I'd have this," she said. "A real family, a home where I belong." "You do belong," I said. "You and Gabriel both. This is your home for as long as you want it, even when Gabriel's older, even when he's loud and messy and breaking things. Especially then," I added. "This house has been too quiet for too long. It needs children's laughter, noisy dinners, birthday parties, Christmas mornings with too much wrapping paper and not nearly enough coffee." Through the window, I saw our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, hanging laundry on her line, humming to herself. In the distance, church bells chimed 9 o'clock, marking another hour in what felt like the first day of the rest of our lives. Gabriel stirred in his carrier, making the little grunts that meant he'd be awake soon and ready for whatever came next. Sophie finished her tea and stood, smoothing his blanket. "Come on, little man," she murmured. "Let's go see what the world has for us today." As I watched her carry my grandson upstairs to change his diaper, heard her talking to him in that gentle tone that reminded me so much of Elena, I felt something I hadn't truly felt in years. Complete, peaceful contentment. The family I'd believed I had for 45 years had been built on secrets, on hierarchy, on the unspoken idea that some people mattered more than others. But this family, this small, unexpected circle of people who found each other through pain and chose each other through love, this was real. This was home. And Gabriel James Martinez Patterson, sleeping peacefully in his nursery with his brave young mother watching over him, would grow up knowing exactly where he belonged. With us. Now I'm curious about you, the one listening to my story. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever faced something similar in your own family? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to read your thoughts. And while you're here, I've left 2 more of this channel's most beloved stories on the end screen. They're full of twists and emotions that might surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story.